guys, so I will be presenting from Chapter 3, Citing Sources and Listing References. So the first question I have for you guys is, why do we cite? So the book gives a quote that I think is a good starting point in answering this question. All statements of fact and opinion require support in order to be convincing to the thoughtful, critical reader. In other words, in order to show that we know what we are talking about, it is important that we provide sources. And then we have to know how to properly cite these sources, obviously to avoid plagiarism. And going back to our quote, so citing sources just makes your argument it validates it and makes it more believable in general. We are essentially answering these two questions before our readers ask. We are answering the questions, how do you know and who says? So, what should we cite? So, the first thing you want to make sure when you choose your source is that your source is authoritative and reliable. Reliable meaning that it has been subject to the peer review process, which is when basically the findings of an experiment or writing are passed through people that are working in that field. This process tries to help they evaluate it, and this process tries to make sure that it's accurate information. The book points out that this isn't, though it's not a foolproof method, these peer-reviewed journals are considered to be accurate accounts of extensive experiments by reputable researchers, and then after they have been evaluated, they are allowed to be published into a journal. So, secondly, you want your sources to be verifiable, so that they are able to be independently consulted by your reader. You want your reader to be able to go and find the sources that you have included and check them out for themselves. Obviously, there may be instances where you may need to include a source that may not be as accessible to your reader for the sake of honesty, but generally if you're picking out and you have a choice, it would be a good idea to try and include sources that your reader is able to check out for themselves. Finally, you want to make sure that the sources you're using are sources that you have read and are confident in the information contained in them. You know that what is said in those sources really truly backs up your argument. You've read more than just the abstract. And as Sydney said last in her video, how it may take a few read-throughs to really get a good idea, but it is worth it to make sure you are understanding what you're including in your writing. These Web of Science, Sci-Fi Scholar, and ACS publications are all good places. You can look for some of these good sources. So what about internet sources? Obviously, the book points out that Wikipedia is not a great source of information, just because it is an ongoing work open to the public to contribute to it, and so this can allow for misinformation. And the book also points out how older pages are considered to be more extensive and accurate. So there's been more time, whereas newer articles or newer pages will typically have less accurate information, more misinformation. But it's not necessarily a bad thing to start out getting a general idea of your stuff from a Wikipedia page, but that is not what you want to use to back up your facts or things that you're trying to prove in your writing. So when do you not have to cite? So you don't have to cite facts that are general knowledge to your audience. So that's where it comes in. It's important to know who your audience is. So who you're writing for, an example that the book gave, mercury is liquid at room temperature and atmospheric pressure. That is something that writing to chemistry are writing to that audience, that is considered to be a fact, like something that's reproducible, and therefore you don't need to cite it. So there is some judgment that you need to make when deciding whether or not you should cite something. Good rule, so reproducible, they're considered facts. But a good rule of thumb is, when in doubt, just go ahead and cite it. So how do we cite? There are two main ways that we do this. We do an in-text citation and a references section. So the book gives 7 guidelines for citing sources. So the first is to cite by inserting a number in the text. So you can do this as a superscript or like these 2 examples here. At the end, the number should come after the punctuation, and you can also put the number in parentheses or brackets, then it will come before the punctuation. Next, you want to make sure you're citing your references in numerical order, starting with number 1, with the exception that you use a source more than once. So make sure that your first source is, in your writing, is the first source in your reference page. So you want to make sure to observe established practices in chemistry when referencing. Authors use only last names. If you have 2 researchers, you separate their names by and. If you have multiple authors, you separate by, you just say the first name of the article followed by et al. Yeah, so you just want to make sure you're following this guidelines. So you want to make the relevance of the cited reference clear to the reader. So this is saying you don't necessarily have to put the reference number at the end of your sentence. If you have a longer sentence and maybe at the beginning of the sentence is the cited part, if it would be more clear to your reader that that is the portion of your writing that you're citing with your source, then you can go ahead and put the number there. Again, using only sources that you have read thoroughly. And finally, when citing the review of the paper, cite the original article also, so you don't want to just rely on the author of that review's interpretation of the article. You want to make sure you have read it and have a good idea of what it says. And finally, to exercise good judgment in how many sources you cite. The book says to avoid citation overkill. So basically just making sure you have quality over quantity sources. Exercising good judgment in that. So the second part, preparing the reference section, include all the references that you have actually used and mentioned in your paper, as well as making sure that you have a source for all of the, or a reference for every source that you have cited in your writing. So you want to make sure to consistently use a format of a major publisher. So 2 examples, the main one being ACS, and the second you can use is the Royal Society of Chemistry. And you want to make sure to provide all the information required for each type of entry. So that's going to be for journal articles and pretty much everything. You're going to want your last name, initials and surnames of all authors, the name of the journal. You can suitably abbreviate it. The volume number of the journal. We will discuss how to abbreviate journal names in, I believe, Chapter 10. And the first page of the article, as well as sometimes the last. This is an example from the book. You have last name, initials, and initials separated by a semicolon. You have the abbreviated name of the journal, italicized, as well as the year, the volume number, and the pages. For books, it's a similar thing, except for make sure you have your title of your book, as well as the publisher, and you need where it was published. And a collection of works, you use your select work, as well as the main name of the book, and then the publisher. A website, it's a little different. You want to make sure you have the name or the organization responsible for that project, as well as you need to make sure to have the URL and the date that you accessed it. For a using a lab manual or handout, reference it as if it were a book. You're going to just, instead of having the publisher, you'll have your instructor's name on the document. Name of the class is the publisher, and your school's name, as well as the location, the year, pages, and finally, information received from your instructor. I gave an example here. You have your instructor's name, your university, where it is, and the class is followed by the year. Here's an example from the book of the references section. And this is my example of our short guide to writing about chemistry cited in ACS format. Thank you guys so much.